So, I think we need to talk about One Piece. About 4 months ago now, on March 1st, 2025, I began my One Piece journey. I had watched Film Red the night before because the main antagonist is partly voiced by my favorite artist. You know who I'm talking about. And it seemed like you didn't need to watch the whole show to understand everything. And that was correct. When I finished watching the movie, I wasn't really that confused other than a few things here and there, but that's not all I felt after finishing. I wanted to watch the anime more than ever, until I came to the realization that there were over 1,100 episodes to sit through. Can I really do this? I asked myself, and eventually I came to my answer. No. But that was far from the end of this story, because I remembered hearing about a certain fan project that made the experience much more enjoyable, especially for a new viewer. That project is One Piece. One of the main complaints about the series, especially the anime, is its pacing, but One Piece cuts things down to be much closer to the manga, shortening scenes and cutting out filler. So while I know the majority of fans watch the entire series, if I were to recommend the anime, I'd say One Piece is a much better place to start. But this video isn't an ad for One Piece. In fact, it's much more than that, or at least, it's the beginning of something much more than that. Welcome to part 1 of my complete review of what I now regard to be the greatest anime of all time, One Piece. As of writing this video, I'm fully caught up to the series, including where the manga is right now, so there's nothing canon that I've missed, at least I'm pretty sure. While my experience was much shorter than I imagine it was for most people, I've watched hundreds of episodes full of action, emotions, and storytelling on a level I've never seen before. I had tried to get into One Piece several times prior, especially after seeing the live action series, but I couldn't get past Syrup Village. I was bored, I'll admit it. But eventually, I decided not to let anything stop me and never give up on the series, which leads us to today and this video, which is actually just the first video in the series. Originally, I wanted to make one big video with every single arc, but then I just realized how long that would take and decided to break it up a bit. The first episode will cover the first 3 sagas, East Blue, Alabasta, and Skypiea, and then we'll get onto other arcs in the following episodes. But with all that introduction out of the way, let's start at what I'd say is the best place to start, the beginning. Our adventure begins in the scene known as the East Blue, with our hilarious yet sometimes surprisingly intelligent protagonist, Monkey D. Luffy. I don't care how you consume the series, be it manga, sub, dub, 4Kids, anything. If Luffy isn't at least in your top 3 characters, are you even truly a One Piece fan? I haven't seen that many anime compared to a lot of people, but Luffy has some of the greatest development and character moments of any series I've watched, and is by far my favourite anime main character. But as we sail through the East Blue, we meet several incredible characters, notably my favourite in the whole series, Roronoa Zoro. Where do I even begin? When it comes to cool characters, very few come to mind that outclass Zoro, in my opinion at least. From the moment he was introduced, he became my number 1 character, and still is to this day. However, his skills and moments in East Blue don't come anywhere near what he does later on, especially somewhat recently. Zoro joins the crew a few episodes in and is the first to do so, marking the birth of one of the greatest character groups I've ever seen, and it keeps on growing. Shortly after Zoro joins Luffy's crew, we are introduced to Nami, who, while far from my favourite Straw Hat, is such a well-written character. For a while in the beginning, she's pretty weak, but fighting skills aside, she has some real depth and an incredible backstory that we'll get into a bit later. The first real arc in the story is Orange Town, where we're introduced to Buggy the Clown. I'll say this now, I don't really like Buggy. He was fun at first, but recently I've started to realize that he's kinda boring. Much later on, something happens to Buggy, which is a decision I really just don't understand. But I'm not talking about that until we're past Wano, which is quite a while from now. The fight with Buggy's crew is pretty enjoyable though, it definitely introduces you to how deep and exciting the story can be. I mean, who expects a random dog to hit them with depression less than 10 episodes in? And I'm not joking. This fight really sets up how things are going to be later on, making the viewer think that, hold on, maybe this isn't just some goofy pirate show. Maybe there's so much more to it that I don't realize yet. And they would be right to think that. In the next arc, Syrup Village, we're introduced to the next Straw Hat pirate, Usopp, who, again, isn't one of my favorites, but is a really fun character. And his backstory, while far from the worst childhood in the series, really makes you feel bad for him. Losing his mother and having his father leave all while he's so young is just heartbreaking. Another moment which makes One Piece special and sets the foundation for what's to come. However, this arc is where I originally dropped the series, and I don't really blame you if you do too. In my opinion, the live action, my first experience with this arc, did everything much better. There really isn't much going on and the scenery hardly changes, but I still found it enjoyable, at least eventually. Another arc that I had high hopes for was Baratie, again coming from the Netflix adaptation. But I did not enjoy the fight with Don Krieg. It just dragged on and had too many fake outs. Also, there was no reason for Pearl to exist. Sorry to the 10 Pearl fans out there. As far as I remember, he doesn't do a whole lot, and then we never see him again. This arc wasn't bad, it just wasn't great either. However, what it did do well was Sanji's introduction and backstory. Well, I'd say backstory, but what we got in Baratie was far from his full origin, as we'll see later in the series. That aside, Sanji is an incredibly entertaining character and has definitely evolved over the course of the series, for better or for worse. Looking at you, Fishman Island. I do have more to say about Sanji, but I'll talk about that later on, when we get to his full backstory, in a later episode. We now make it to the climax of the East Blue Saga, Arlong Park. And I have to say, this arc is just incredible, especially for the time. It takes on some pretty heavy themes like tyranny, murder, and slavery, made even heavier seeing them through the eyes of Nami, who was very young at the time, making one of the toughest backstories to watch ever. The scene where she screams Arlong's name was the first time One Piece brought me to tears, and it absolutely would not be the last. The iconic walk to Arlong Park was so cool to watch, and the final fight was pretty fun. This was also where Luffy received his first bounty of 30 million berries, which, looking back on it now, is basically nothing. I mean, we're definitely going to see it increase a lot later on. The end of Arlong Park brings us to our final arc in East Blue, Loguetown. I personally wasn't a huge fan of this arc, as not much happened in the beginning. I did like Smoker's introduction, and while I wasn't a fan of Tashigi at first, later arcs have brought me to like her a lot more. This arc also sees the introduction of Dragon, a character who hasn't really done a whole lot, even across 1,153 chapters, but it was still cool to see him come into the series. From Loguetown, we finally set off towards the Grand Line and the beginning of the next saga, Alabasta. This saga begins in a pretty unusual place. Well, two to be exact. First is Reverse Mountain, one of the many parts of the One Piece world to fully defy physics. But despite being the name of the arc, Reverse Mountain isn't really the focal location. That title has to go to Laboon, this guy. You may be thinking, a whale? How is that a location? And to that I say, this is One Piece. Of course there's an island and corridors inside the whale. I mean, what else did you expect? Laboon's initial backstory is extremely sad, and I can't remember if it made me cry, but I wouldn't be surprised. I say initial for a reason though, as what comes later is even better. However, in later news, this arc introduces probably my favorite non-Straw Hat introduced in this saga, Vivi. Although, some would argue that she was a Straw Hat at the time. I'll look closer at her character later, but I really enjoyed her development from villain to essentially a member of the crew. From Laboon and the Twin Capes, we sail on to Whiskey Peak. An arc that I was surprised to hear most people didn't enjoy. Personally, I had no problem with Luffy vs Zoro. Sure, the reason for it was pretty dumb, but to me it shows that the Straw Hats still have their differences and aren't used to working together. This arc is also the first time we meet Nico Robin, who is definitely one of my favorite Straw Hats now. She's by far one of the most interesting characters in the series, and that's saying something. But at this point, she's not an ally. She's Miss All Sunday, an enemy and high-ranking member of Baroque Works. We then head to Little Garden, an arc that definitely happened. I would like to say more about the arc, but my memory is definitely not helping. I enjoyed it, but it's not all that memorable. One of my favorite parts of it, however, is that it's the first time that Elbaf is mentioned in the series. Why is this important? Well, because if you didn't know, Elbaf is the current arc in the One Piece manga, which started in chapter 1126. Little Garden started 26 years ago in chapter 115. When I first watched Little Garden, I knew that Elbaf was the current arc, so I was incredibly surprised to hear him mention this early on. It just goes to show how incredible Oda's writing and world building is. Speaking of the world, next up is Drum Kingdom. This arc was absolutely perfect. There were so many emotional moments, and I was once again brought to tears, this time by Chopper's backstory. Chopper is a really fun character. He has several main jokes which always manage to make me smile, even if they are pretty similar. Seeing how he struggled after eating his devil fruit broke me, especially when it came to Hiruluk's death. Chopper just wanted to help him, but couldn't. That's why Chopper joining the Straw Hats is still one of my favorite moments in the series. It just means so much for his character. I know I said this arc was perfect, but I wasn't really a huge fan of Waffle. He just felt kind of boring, but not enough to make me dislike the arc in any way. After Jump Kingdom, the crew sails to Alabasta, the setting of the biggest arc so far, and it really didn't disappoint. It kept Jump Kingdom's emotion going and became one of the most important parts of the story, introducing the poneglyphs and ancient weapons, as well as a showcase of just how strong some of the villains can get in the series. And Crocodile, while seeming impossible to beat, is far from the strongest character in the series. Probably not even top 20. But I think it's best if we forget about power scaling for now, because I have to say that in terms of storytelling, Alabasta is just incredible. I'll admit that it was a little boring at first, a lot of walking in a desert, how enjoyable can it be? But when it got going, it really got going. While being limited by the animation standards of the time, every fight was super fun, especially Zoro vs Mr. One, and Luffy's final showdown with Crocodile. This arc is also the reason I like Vivi so much. It was really a perfect culmination of her character, showing just how much she cares about the people of her kingdom. She doesn't fight, but that doesn't matter when she brings so much depth and emotion to the story. Before we can leave, however, we get a new addition to the crew, and like I said, one of my favorites, Nico Robin. I really loved her character when she was introduced, but that went even further in later parts of the story, and I'll get to that in a future episode. After finishing Alabasta, I no longer had any intention of dropping the series. I had made it. One Piece was actually good? To answer that question, yeah, kinda. Except, not just kinda. When I finished Alabasta, I loved the series, but wasn't ready to call it the greatest anime like many had claimed. But of course, the story gets better, and we're about to see just that. After the crew leaves Alabasta, they discover a map for a sky island, and eventually make it to the setting of our next arc, Jaya. I didn't love this arc, but that's not to say it was bad. I enjoyed it, and it was definitely a change of pace from the action of the previous saga. This is the introduction of some pretty vital characters, most notably the man who will likely be the series' main villain, Marshall D. Teach, also known as Blackbeard. Well, I say main villain, but I'm probably only referring to pirates when it comes to that. While he doesn't do anything too worth mentioning in Jaya, aside from his iconic Dreams Never Die line, he's one of the most important characters in the series, so this arc is therefore very important as well. We also get the introduction of Bellamy, a pretty uninteresting character at this point, but Jaya isn't where he's important, and that's something I'll cover in a later episode. I'm starting to notice how much I'm saying that I'll talk more about something later, and I feel like that just shows how incredibly well written and well made One Piece is. You don't get everything about a place or person the second you're introduced to them. It's spread out. It makes you want to know more. It gives so much depth to these characters and locations that you probably wouldn't get if everything was unloaded on you at once. So Jaya, while not seeming that important at first, is a vital part of the story looking back on it. So even though I said I wasn't a huge fan of it at first, I really appreciate what it did for the series. And the next arc, while arguably much less important to the story, was still incredibly enjoyable. You know what I'm talking about, it's time for Skypiea. After watching Skypiea, it didn't seem like it meant much for the story, especially as I watched more of the series. I kinda expected it to have some impact, but I wasn't disappointed by the lack of mention later on either. However, I was pretty surprised to find out that there's a lot of people who fully skipped this arc. Sure, it doesn't affect the story too much, but it was such a fun time and is honestly kinda underrated in my opinion. Was it perfect? No, but I really enjoyed almost everything here. It wasn't too memorable or anything, but I remember being really invested in it. Maybe the most I'd been with the series so far. Enel is a very well written villain and poses a huge threat to the Straw Hats for most of the arc. At times, it felt like there was no way they could win. I mean, they were facing a god, albeit a self-proclaimed one. And do you remember when I said this arc wasn't important? Well, I kinda lied. This arc is the first introduction to one of the core elements of One Piece's current power system, but the name is kept hidden. It's referred to as Mantra, but we now know that in reality, it was actually Observation Haki, one of the 3 Haki types that are integral to fights in the current era of the series. And also, towards the end of the arc, Robin discovers a message left by Goldie Roger, the king of the pirates. This not only reveals that it came to Skypiea, but it becomes even more of a big deal when we get the reveal that it technically wasn't Roger that left the message. Sure, he said it, but he didn't write it. He couldn't. When it was first found, Everyone questioned how it was written there, despite Roger not knowing the ancient language. And we didn't find out until at least 700 episodes later in a flashback during Wano. That flashback is one of my favourite in the series, but we were talking about Skypiea, weren't we? We can talk about Wano when we get to Wano, but for now I gotta wrap up this video. So yeah, this is part 1 of my One Piece review series. This is by far the biggest series I've ever made. I just hope I can get it out in time. Overall, this part of the story is incredible, and this is only the only sagas. We have a lot more to get into. The next video will be a review of Water 7, Enies Lobby, and Thriller Bark, one of my favourite sections of the story. After that, I'll move on to the Summit War Saga, Saba Odi to Post-War. So anyway, thanks for watching everyone, stay tuned for the next episode, and I'll see you then.